What does it take to be granted asylum in the United States? Well, spoiler alert, it's getting harder and harder. As the Trump administration furthers its effort to crack down on U.S. immigration, people who face harm or even death in their home countries are being put at risk. We spoke to an immigration attorney who's handled hundreds of asylum cases to look at how the administration's rollbacks are affecting asylum seekers and what actually constitutes a good asylum case.
Most people think that if someone is genuinely afraid for their life and has a good reason for it, that they should be granted asylum. And I agree with that because it's hard to watch people suffer like this, but the law right now does not allow that.
First, let's define what asylum is and how it differs from refugee or immigrant status. An asylum seeker is someone who fears harm or persecution in their home country and is seeking legal protection in a new one. There are two types of asylum: affirmative and defensive. In affirmative asylum cases, people can proactively request asylum when they arrive to the U.S. or within a year of doing so. In defensive asylum cases, people who are facing deportation can request asylum to avoid removal proceedings. A refugee, on the other hand, is defined by the International Rescue Committee as someone who's been forced from their home because of war, violence, or persecution. An immigrant, meanwhile, is someone who makes the conscious decision to leave his or her own home to settle in a new place. There can be overlap between the immigrant, refugee, and asylum categories, but to apply for asylum, which is a legal process in the US, there's a specific set of rules you have to follow. First, you have to be physically present in the US or at a port of entry, like an airport or border checkpoint, to apply. And you have to be willing and able to prove that you have a fear of persecution, and then lay out the reasons for that fear, along with a lot of other personal information in this 12-page application.
Let's say you're a dissident in China and you're working for freedom, democracy. Maybe you're an artist who's expressing themselves against the government, and they punish you somehow in a way that a country with more freedom wouldn't. That's a pretty classic asylum case. That's kind of what we'd expect. That's kind of the post-Cold War framework of political asylum, but there's also, of course, asylum based on race, religion, nationality, and then what we call membership in a particular social group, which is where it gets a little more complicated.
It's complicated because what qualifies as a social group isn't totally straightforward. Generally, it applies to traits that people cannot or should not be required to change, such as gender or sexual orientation. So yes, being persecuted for being a woman or a member of the LGBTQ+ community would apply here. But sometimes the lines are more blurred, like whether families or victims of domestic violence count as social groups. Historically, both of them have counted, but former U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions worked to roll back protections for both those groups.
The Attorney General actually has incredible executive authority to rewrite the law in immigration in ways that they just don't in other fields. And that has been devastating for Central American asylum because so many of my cases are people who are being targeted as a family, as a unit.
Powerful incentives were created for aliens to come here illegally and claim a fear of return. In effect, word spread that by asserting fear, they could remain in the United States one way or another. Far too often, that rumor proved to be true.
In 2018, Sessions issued an opinion overruling a previous decision by the Board of Immigration Appeals that allowed asylum for survivors of domestic violence. Sessions' opinion narrowed the types of violence that applied to the social group category, essentially stating that violence committed by, quote, non-governmental actors no longer qualified.
He went out of his way to say that if it's just private violence, if it's just violence between two people, then that's not our problem.
However, you could be at serious threat of persecution or violence based on any of these established categories and still not qualify for asylum in the US. And that's because your case depends more on who's actually persecuting you than the real risks you face.
Who and why? That's really what it comes down to. It's possible that you may not get asylum because the person who's going to do those things to you isn't the right kind of person for an asylum case. And I know how arbitrary and strange that seems, to have your safety depend on who is persecuting you and why, but that's the law. I tweeted about a case in which I'd learned that my client had been killed in his home country, very much along the lines of what we'd been told he might be. And this was an asylum case, so he would He was before the judge, telling the judge that he was afraid to go back and that he was going to be killed if he went back. You know, I have to say, I think that this has probably happened before, but I didn't know.
Asylum cases are strongest when persecutors are governmental actors or supported by the home country's government or police. For example, what if your persecutor is a member of an independent gang? That might not be a strong asylum claim. And generally, it's going to be difficult to get asylum if you've got any criminal record, even low-level misdemeanors like cannabis possession. And the application asks you, among other things, to include a certified copy of all arrest reports, court depositions, and sentencing documents. The Trump administration has been making it harder and harder for people to qualify for asylum, but it's also made it harder to even apply in the first place. In July 2019, the DOJ issued a rule stating that migrants who pass through specific countries such as Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala would be denied asylum in the US if they don't apply in those countries first. This rule applies to almost all migrants who reach the US-Mexico border, mostly from Central America, but also from Africa. The policy's critics argue this system would effectively put an end to America's asylum process as we know it. The administration has also begun implementing plans to return asylum seekers to Mexico while they wait for their claims to be processed in the US, sending tens of thousands of people to cities known for high rates of violence, kidnapping, and murder.
Ya cuando a mí me dicen que me regresan a Juárez, yo siento que fue algo que como que fue un balde de agua fría que me tiraron. Y sentí que todo se me derrumbó otra vez. Y yo dije, Dios mío, ¿qué voy a hacer yo en Juárez? No conozco a nadie. Para mí México para mí mis hijos andando sola, no es un lugar, como le puedo decir, que yo confiable para salir con mis 3 hijos sola. Entonces es algo que yo decía, yo cómo voy a enfrentar todo esto.
And on top of all this, there's another catch. If you apply for asylum through all the right channels, but your request is denied, USCIS can use the 12 pages of information you just submitted to deport you. The question for us is, what responsibility does the US have to the people who are seeking asylum here?